Oracle of the Forgotten, The Humans, The Wandering Swordsman, Part 4. The road to Tradewinds was mostly quiet, at least so far. Nalia had tried to convince the swordsman to hold his blade, but both ended up fighting the odd spirit, beast, or other creature from time to time. By the time the two got closer to the city, they were attacked by a larger group of spirits and beasts. It wasn't more than a few minutes before the pair had fought their way through and were now standing in the powder and ash as the fallen began to dissolve around them. Nalia felt as though the two were being watched. She paused a moment, looking past the mortal to the distance. The sense was gone again, but she couldn't be certain they weren't still being followed. She suggested they stay at a tavern when they reached the city, saying she knew the best one in town. Odilon decided to push back by calling her princess, since she seemed determined to run this adventure without asking his opinion. By now, he probably should have known better, but the woman swept around, knocking one of his legs from under him with her spear. This again knocked him to the ground, and the woman leaned down to look at him. He found himself cursing loudly as his head nearly struck the ground again. If he hadn't moved his hand to protect himself, it would have. "I am anything but royalty, and stop cursing so much. It's not very gentlemanly." She gave him a playful smirk before standing and spinning her spear. She placed it on her back and then told him they needed to move. Odilon himself was older than he appeared, yet watching her sometimes reminded him more of a teenager than an adult. Despite his statement that she must think she's in charge again, she simply ignored him at this point. It left his mind to wander. How could she be from the Kingsguard? They died long ago. Even worse, he felt everything she said was the truth. A part of him had to question it all. He'd never been around someone who felt truly honest, and he had to wonder if she'd just found a way to trick the senses of others. He couldn't figure it out. What is she really? While his trust was limited, hers wasn't much better. Both had their own scars, and she was not willing to compromise on anything right now. They were 2 hours from the next city. She warned him that it would be busy and try not to wander too far. He was half insulted. He's not a child, after all. If anything, he probably had more experience with humanity than she did. Still, she stopped moving before he could say anything more. He started to ask what she was staring at, but he felt it first. A sharp, burning pain like an iron branding his chest. He'd felt that level of fire before, but never from the mark on his own body. He saw her energy begin to swirl around her, and it hit him. She's a demon. How had he forgotten? His blade screamed loudly in his mind. Kill. Kill it before it kills you. Of course, it decided she was the demon he was sensing. Why wouldn't it? The thing was conscious, it was aware, and it had settled on her presence as its latest target. The woman looked him over. He was colder now than whatever she sensed in the distance. The look in his eyes actually allowed her to question her own safety for a moment. After all, he was still allowed to kill her if he could do it. Almost as if a response to the burning inside of him, the voice in her own mind told her to kill and destroy him. Claim her power by tearing him apart. The woman shook her head and glanced at the spirits beginning to close in on them. The meadow that had been empty was now filled with an unnatural surface of darkness. Spirits were beginning to be called up from where they'd fallen in the ages past. His hand rested on his blade, yet his attention turned to the spirits first. If he meant to fight her, it might be better to allow her to kill off their enemies together. In that moment, he sensed it. There was a much darker, much larger presence nearby. He turned, starting to walk towards the source of this new energy. That was until she suddenly threw her spear at his feet. "Do not go past this. You may fall into the spirit world." She didn't say much more. Odilon was not about to take this from anyone. He could sense the power growing now, and the burning beneath his tunic was turning into a proper shimmering light from his own mark. She insisted again that he do not cross the line. Not that he cared or would even listen. Now his attention was fully on a powerful demonic presence, one that seemed to be not far past where her spear landed. Was she protecting it? Was she trying to hide it from him? What a foolish thing to do. This shadowed energy and presence called to him like a siren, screaming for him to fight, to destroy, to kill. Whatever it was, the blade wanted to taste its blood, and he really wasn't in the mood to deny it. The mortal didn't have time to move forward before a dark mist began to swirl in the distance, taking on a pattern like smoke as it moved around the battlefield slowly. It seemed to be everywhere, yet flow in a specific direction. Nalia had her attention on the human. She saw his eyes change, flicker, moving from a near ice blue to an extremely dark blue, and then fade back to flare red around his now purely white irises. She'd seen this. It seemed so familiar to her, but she didn't have time to think about it when she felt a cold chill. A soft wind blew past her ear, along her neck with an ice-cold essence. "So, you're here. I wonder what would happen if I called him here. The one who owns you." The voice made her pause, almost freeze. The half-demon didn't know that her skin was growing pale. She couldn't move. Her human half was dominating her mind now, frozen by the demon's spell for a few moments. Odilon didn't care for others much, but as he saw her freeze and heard the whispered words of this being, something hit him, a feeling he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something protective. Owned. Does any creature own another? His thoughts didn't matter. He wasn't sure if it was instinct or just moving her away from his target. He grabbed her wrist, dragging her closer to him and his weapon both. As he pulled her close, he could feel the burning within his chest growing even hotter now. He needed a target, and he needed to draw blood. His presence somehow seemed to release something within the half-demon. She pushed him away as she hesitantly spoke. Hey, let me go." She wasn't fully aware of what was going on, but the movement brought her closer to her spear and the slowly forming portal that the demon was opening with its presence. That portal had started as a tear and was slowly opening to build more space for creatures to come through, but it seemed weak, nearly unstable. Perhaps because the demon was busy playing games rather than focusing on opening it. The dark mist began to form into a solid mass, a shadow shaped like an overly tall man, nearly 9 feet tall in total. He began to grow more solid, dark skin forming his body as random flares of fire appeared within his form. The brightest was a central plate on his chest and one on his belt, both burning as if they were on fire. His gauntlets were close behind, flickering with color as smoke still continued to dance around him. His red-gold eyes settled on Nalia as he began to fully form into the dark entity that was closest to his true form. "Oh, come now, princess. Surely you can understand that you're his and his alone." The creature seemed to entirely ignore the human, who began to move to place himself between the two. Rather, this entity kept taunting the girl. "I suppose I could borrow you when he gets bored of you like he did all the others." I am no princess. You should go back where you came from while you can. It was partly a threat. Nalia was tired of this. Every time they came around, it was the same, always with that title for her. She could feel the darkness in her growing now. The human side was already shutting down, and by the time she spoke, her eyes were already turning black. Leave her alone. Odilon's voice was enough to draw her attention for a moment, but only enough to glance at him. His sword was still resting on his shoulder as he stepped between the two of them. Not your concern, human. The demon phased out of existence, moving around the mortal before walking towards Nalia again from another angle. You need to come back to us. We can make you so much more. As he reached towards the woman again, she growled, No, you have no right to touch me. Her left foot came back and she swung around, grabbing her spear and throwing it towards the demon near her. Even with her unnatural speed, he caught it with the most sadistic grin she'd ever seen. So sweet of you to think you could harm me, Nalia. He took the spear that he'd caught and slammed the entire thing into her face directly between her horns. She nearly flew backwards, barely able to stop herself right in front of the now fully formed portal. From deep within, she could hear the beasts marching towards the gate, soft growls of creatures that were barely drowning out the screams from deeper within the gate itself. She was dizzy, off balance, but knew that she couldn't afford to fall into that portal as well. She ran forward, rushing past the creatures. She moved in and out of the shadow to increase her speed. It shouldn't have been enough, not with one of his kind, but as soon as she was past him, she moved herself to a safer point. She was just turning around as a new sound reached her ears. It was her spear. She knew the sound of it perfectly. Something metal had impacted it, and at the moment it was flying high into the air again. Odilon had rushed past the demon, lowering the blade to reach under her spear and flip it towards the sky as he continued his strike in an arch across the demon. The dark creature barely had time to step back just enough to minimize the damage. Still, his hand reached down a moment and his eyes widened. A red flicker of flame blew through the cut on his body and he smiled. Finally, a truly dark smile. You injured me. Oh, mortal, you do not know what that means. Let me return the favor. He extended an arm, stretching it even beyond its current length to knock the swordsman away again. By that time, Nalia had grabbed her spear from the air and rushed the creature. She jumped as high as she could, swinging down at him from above to impale him through the shoulder with her weapon. Her aim had been a little off, but being dizzy from the blow hadn't helped her much, or slowed her down, for that matter. The spear dragged downwards, but even so, it held her with her feet off the ground. If you wanted me so much, you could have asked. The smile of the demon sickened her nearly instantly as he reached his hand around her armor. His claws dug slightly into her stomach as he lifted her. This motion relieved the pain from his own injury, but the force of his hand crushed her armor and tore into her skin. Her eyes settled on the creature as she began to swing herself around, trying but failing to kick him. Suddenly she realized her position and something inside of her changed. Put me down. It was loud, commanding, and for a brief moment, both the demon and the human about to attack him paused. Odilon felt a presence from her that made him stop cold. Something he'd never felt before, and for the moment, even he wanted to see her either back on the ground or force this opponent to set her there. The demon suddenly growled as she swung to kick his arm with all the power she could. The creature instantly dropped her, however, she didn't realize at the same moment Odilon had actually come at the demon again. He rushed forward, taking a strike across the middle of the demon's back. The creature had at that same instant dropped the woman. After pulling her spear from his shoulder and backing away again, she realized that the human had once again helped her to break free. The demon himself turned to the mortal, fires burning through his body to heal his wounds. "Mortal, this is not your concern. Leave. You cannot win here." Black blood dripped along the blade and from the still burning wounds to the ground. The demon could no longer be troubled with this creature. He had a job to do, and this was mostly just an irritation. The gates began to release the first of the beasts. He knew an army would come, Tradewinds would fall as per his orders, and these two were merely a distraction. But the girl, oh, what a prize. Nalia was preparing for another attack when the creature rushed her, this time with such speed and force that she dropped her spear. He grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against a large tree nearby as he lifted her again. She tried to speak, but she could barely even breathe through his tightening grip. "Oh, come on now, princess. We could have such fun if you'd stop fighting me. You could even be mine." He didn't care anymore. She was strong enough. Maybe he could even use her to dethrone his master if she would play along. Her struggling was already slowing, but she continued to kick at the air, trying to find a way to break free from the demon again. Odilon was now enraged, not only by being ignored. He found himself more angry that the demon thought that he had some right to this woman and was offering her no choice. A sickness, a dark memory from his past, but mostly rage just built up on years of being broken down by creatures like this, seemed to stir something in him. A white flame seemed to form at the grip of the hand holding his large blade. The human's eyes seemed to get darker, colder, but more like the piercing ice of winter than ever before. He held his blade, lifted it, and rushed the demon. No one should be forced. It was his own voice, his own thoughts, but the voice within his mind agreed so loudly he almost thought it could be heard from the outside. The demon was ignoring him. Focused on the woman, it meant there was a much better chance. This time, every muscle in the human engaged properly, and he jumped nearly as high as the half-demon had before, even with the weight of that giant blade dragging him towards the ground. That same blade fell from the top of the demon's head to the ground as if cutting through nothing more than paper. It slammed against the ground hard enough to shake the tree that the woman was pinned against. Nalia's viewpoint was different than his. The lack of air was making her vision blur. As she felt her eyes wanting to drift close, she saw the demon's eyes widen, and then a black spray covered most of her face and all of her shoulder. The demon's face split, drawing itself open and into two halves. Tendrils tried to cling the pieces together, but it seemed as if they couldn't touch one another. Nalia felt the ground rushing towards her. She landed, kneeling now as she watched the demon begin to try to drag its form together. Even as its hands tried to pull the two halves to itself, it could do nothing. The same ash it came from began to scatter slowly from it as the creature fragmented and broke apart. What she felt, though, was something she couldn't explain. As the demon broke, she felt the soul itself, the pattern, the song, crumbling like a broken music box. The music ticked in her mind, notes slowly falling off with each round, as the demon came apart at the very seams of reality, and then silence. She was shaken, but she knew she had to move. The beasts entering the portal and the spirits were no longer under the demon's control, and they began to thrash wildly. The portal itself collapsed nearly instantly, first collapsing the stones, then shattering like glass on the ground. The force ripped the energy within, shutting it tight from the world, while the creatures, still partially through the portal, were crushed and destroyed within the falling debris. The village, it isn't far. She stood and grabbed her weapon, somewhat less steady than before. She knew they could get there, and the guards would aid them as well. She pulled her hood up, hoping it was still intact enough to hide what she was, or at least that the guards would be too distracted to care. She knew these guards could handle a handful of beasts and even a few spirits. If anything, this wasn't much more than the night would normally bring. Despite her wishing to protect the mortal, it was honestly him who cut the path for them to arrive at the village. She hardly had the energy nor time to remove more than a spirit or two along the way. He was fast, faster than she thought he should be, but she had no energy to think of it right now. When they reached the gates of Tradewinds, the man stopped suddenly, staring up at them with an odd silence. The half-demon came to stand beside him, resting a hand on his arm a moment, in part to steady herself, and in part just because she felt like she should. She started to speak and was cut off by his words. It's been a while, that's all. He'd been to the city more than a few times. It was actually odd to him that she'd never come up on any of his travels here in the past. The woman directed him to a nearby inn. The barkeep there called her Shade rather than Nalia, and asked if she wanted her usual drink. Odilon raised an eyebrow a moment at the sudden name change. It shouldn't have surprised him. He was often referred to Wanderer or Swordsman and hardly used his own name. Perhaps it was her way of hiding what she was, too. The older gray-haired man had river blue eyes that seemed to hardly leave the woman. He knew exactly what she was, a pretty young thing, but he figured that her demon blood had made her that way. Suddenly, a cough caught his attention. The man who'd come in with her asked for an ale. He nodded, then turned his attention back from the irritated young man to the young lady once again. An ale in a room, anything you have. She didn't care at this point. She couldn't drink much with her injuries, and she needed time to get cleaned up. The man directed her to a room at the back top hall, offering to deliver the key at the same time as their drinks. Still, Odilon found himself annoyed again. He wasn't even sure why. These two clearly knew each other. They talked like old friends. Maybe it was just the way the man looked at Nalia. No, that didn't matter, and it wasn't his business anyway. It wasn't long, though, before the man leaned back in his chair and rested his feet on the table. He was impatient, irritated, and trying to distract himself from the many thoughts running through his mind. Nalia smirked slightly. He was so rough, hardly royalty, but he could learn a few manners. It wasn't long before that spirit of hers came out again, slapping the man's feet, just as a reminder. He jumped up, pulling his feet from the table. "Damn it, woman, why the hell are you so bent on hurting me?" The words made her smile, despite the ice-cold glare in his eyes. His mind whispered to him, "She's a demon. You can't trust demons. Kill her now." Feet don't go on the table. She held her hand out just in time to reach for the ale the man had delivered and smiled slightly. "Neither does your spear," he growled back. He was enraged at her insistence upon manners. It seemed entirely out of place for a demon. Well, it wouldn't hurt to learn some manners. You aren't being very gentlemanly. She shrugged, then placed her spear away, reaching for his drink as well. Glancing down a moment, she noticed the reflection and how much blood was on her face and clothes. The barkeep hadn't even mentioned it. "I'm going to the room." She grumbled slightly at the situation. Don't stay up too late. She shoved the drink into his hands without another word and then retreated to the quiet of the room. She was more than aware of this place. She never stayed anywhere else in this town anymore. It wasn't long before she closed up the door, and then she moved a privacy curtain to the side of the large bath and began to run the water. The dwarves had a way to bring hot water directly to the rooms, and it had been put in this tavern long before most places. Some alliance had existed between the owners and the dwarven people. She was more than happy to see the water running. She took some into her hands, washing her face quickly before pulling off her clothing. Her shirt was completely soaked in blood. She cut away the bandages to see that 2 of her scars nearly perfectly circled the 2 deepest puncture wounds. It almost made her laugh, but she knew that it was a sign she messed up again. Her fingers trailed the wound before she finished undressing herself entirely, including the remaining bandages except for the one the human had given her days before. As she lowered herself into the water, she hissed. It hurt, but unlike many, she was aware of the healing properties of the water in this town. It was part of why Tradewinds had thrived. Odilon was still angry that she had the audacity to think that she could command him. He sat his drink down and growled slightly before picking it back up. He was trying to figure out exactly what he was feeling in the first place. Picking up the mug, he felt it in his hand. Sticky, tacky, the warrior in him knew this feeling all too well. Glancing at the glass, he noticed it wasn't from the other demon. No, this was red, just as any human would be. Perhaps a little darker, but otherwise it was quite clear where the source had been. A sigh escaped him. He shouldn't care. He took a sip of his drink before glancing in the direction the woman had gone. Which of them really needed taking care of? Sometimes he wasn't even sure anymore. By the time he arrived, she'd already cleaned most of her wounds and applied a small amount of salve to them. She was standing in only her underclothing, bandages around part of her body. She was busy trying to fix them when he walked in. A lot of things were hard not to notice, but as he had his mind on her wounds, he traced over her body, trying to see if there was anything new aside from those bandages. It was impossible not to notice the scars across her back. Deep gashes reminded him of whip marks he had on himself. She'd been hit with something similar to a flogger at some point as well, and he began to see how much he failed to understand many things about her. Along with the acid burns that were on her left side, there was a large amount of cuts, wounds, injuries, and even somehow her skin had a natural set of changes in its own color. Some of her skin was dark, some light. Her scars seemed to choose to be lighter than the rest of her, only leaving them standing out more. It was a short time of staring before he realized the wounds weren't the only thing that had caught his attention, though, and he actually had to glance away a moment to take his mind off of it. You don't have the decency to knock, either? She pulled her shirt on casually. She was embarrassed, but wasn't about to let him know this. She was grateful she'd been turned away from the door. A dragoon should have been used to the intrusion. He shrugged, then shook his head. He'd been in the war. He'd fought with men and women at his side as his equals. Her presence was no different, and he needed to remind himself of that. Back to the discussion of being injured, he wasn't about to let her distract him again, even though she commanded him to mind his tone about her life as the dragoon. She mentioned that he was observant, which was helpful. She was even a little surprised to learn that he had seen others watching her as she left for the stairs. It had missed her attention somehow. She finally told him that in the morning she was headed to the contract hall for the bounty keepers. The man was confused at first, and she actually refused to elaborate. She instead asked him about his bandages, wanting to check on them. Her changing the subject was obvious, and he insisted that she explain herself. He knew he had a bounty, but he wanted to be certain of her intentions. Your bounty, there's no reason for it to be what it is. I want to know who placed it. She was too tired to try to deflect him. For all of us, isn't it? Odilon didn't care. He knew the mercenaries were considered bandits by most, and honestly, their bounties had mounted over the years. No, just you. Baelith and his entire city has less bounty than you do. The words were clear enough, and she was confused, but the mention of that name... Baelith had been the second closest thing to a true father to him. The man had treated him well, taught him, even protected him from time to time. Odilon hated that he felt a near sadness at the mention of the name. He couldn't forgive him for not sending help. Unlike all the others, though, he was intent on giving that man one chance to explain himself. According to the paper in his pocket, Baelith and Gawain had traded him for some unknown reason. He still needed the answer. She seemed to recognize his discomfort and changed the subject. Rather, she chose to start tending to his wounds. He'd broken the stitches, which earned him a bit of a quick lecture, and her demanding to know how he intended to do his job if dead from an infection. If nothing else, it made the man chuckle at the absurdity of it all. He'd never had any trouble dealing with this in the past. He would have cut it out and embraced the scar instead. What surprised him more was that when she applied the ointment this time, she closed her eyes. There was hardly any of it left, but the pain relief was instant, unlike last time. She was shaking slightly, hand over his wound as warmth flooded through it. Demons can't heal others, though, can they? His thoughts were now beyond confused. He'd never seen this. He'd seen them animate a corpse, close a wound in the most painful manner, but nothing like this. While the energy in his mark pulsed, it was calm, like a heartbeat this time. He wasn't even sure what to make of this. Using her own magic to remove more of the infection took more of her energy than she'd wanted. After stitching him and bandaging him, she stood shakily. He demanded to look at her shoulder, and she insisted that he needed to be resting. She ended up in a nearby chair, meditating to recover some of her energy. She had no idea how much of a toll it had all taken on her. She wasn't even aware of it when the larger man picked her up like a small child and moved her to rest in the warmth of the bed. She wouldn't know till morning. If anything, he decided it was better for him to stand guard. He could rest lightly and would know if anything in the room moved even the smallest amount. His mark would warn him of any other dangers. For now, as she slept, he let his mind wander on the entire situation. He drew a cloth from his own bag and began to clean the large amounts of demon and other blood off the surface of his blade. It was damaged these days, dents, cuts, even broken from a previous battle. At some point, he knew he'd have to get it repaired. He was pretty certain he knew just the man to do it, but for now, he needed to understand why, of all the men in his group, he was the one with the largest bounty. For that, he decided he was going to go with her in the morning.